disorder works here, where does it stop?
The migrants will have to leave the bell before the 12th of September. President Trump has ruled out sending any American troops to Ukraine as part of a peace agreement. In an interview with US media, Donald Trump also acknowledged it's possible President Putin won't agree to a deal. David Salvo is from the Alliance for Securing Democracy.
It would be much more of a credible deterrent to have NATO forces, or at least some contingent of European and American boots on the ground. I don't believe Russia is going to be so brazen as to attack Ukraine. And without that, all bets are off down the road.
A report has found social media algorithms are feeding self-harm content to young people on an industrial scale. England's Children's Commissioner separately warning that more than a quarter of 11-year-olds have stumbled upon adult videos. Dame Rachel de Souza says that's why the Online Safety Act forcing sites to bring in stricter checks is so vital. She's clear on what needs to happen next.
I need Ofcom to back that bill and for them to do the work of protecting children. 6-year-olds seeing violent, coercive porn. We've got to do better. We've got to protect them.
A disabled MP has defended her use of taxis after a watchdog launched an investigation into her expenses. Labour's Kate Osborne says her increased use had been recommended by Parliament's own health service because she was left in constant pain by an operation. The Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority says the probe is looking at travel costs but wouldn't comment further. People with houses worth more than £500,000 could face an annual property tax under reported plans to replace stamp duty. Ministers reportedly asked officials to look at options for the tax, which would remove the levy on people when they buy property. David Smith is the Sunday Times' economics editor, says reforming the property tax system could be beneficial in the long term.
If you can get around the problem of, as I say, the people who are asset rich but income poor, and there are ways of getting around that, I think fundamentally this is a good thing for the Treasury to be looking at. This is a kite that is worth flying, I think. And whether we see anything solid in the autumn budget or whether we see a consultation on this, which I suspect is more likely, I think this is a good area for the Treasury and for the Chancellor.
And for a roundup of news on demand, subscribe to the Times News Briefing on any podcast platform.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, on the free Times Radio app, and via your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
Really good to have him with us on Pienaar and Friends, and our good conversation in very good company. It doesn't come much better than Scarlett Maguire, the director of the Merlin Advisory pollster and the political commentator, ConservativeHome founder, now Reform supporter and all-round troublemaker, Tim Montgomerie. Great to have you here, Tim. Good to see you, Scarlett. Let me come to you first then, Tim, for your thought for the day.
Well, it's about a few days ago now, but I think it's a story of some import. And that was Nigel Farage wrote to the Prime Minister and asked for 6 peerages for reform. And basically, the Labour government have turned around and said, no, you can't have any. And I just think, I would say this, wouldn't I? I'm a reform supporter, but actually I think it's much bigger than that. It's reform secured a very large vote at the last general election, and the Green Party have representation in the House of Lords. And to give reform no representation at all just seems to me to be extraordinarily narrow-minded and partisan. Not least, you think about the possibility, which is, a possibility, not necessarily a probability, that reform forms the next government in this country. They would potentially take power with no representation in the House of Lords at all. So you'd have no one there who sort of can help guide legislation through, can answer questions. And, we have an unusual constitution in this country, but not to give reform any early possibility that they could understand and negotiate the second chamber. I just think it's just so short-sighted. And we need some sort of, I think, formalisation of how nominations to the House of Lords are made in proportion to how parties do elections, but just for it to be completely in the gift of the Prime Minister at the moment, who can act in a partisan way. I don't think it makes much sense.
How does that complaint square with precedent, Tim? I mean, we have, for example, seen members of the Green Party put into the House of Lords. We've certainly seen members of various Ulster parties put into the House of Lords too. The DUP, the UUP, they had peers as well. So I guess if you, by way of maths, your argument has some force, at least on the strength of the last election result, where you got, what was it, 14% of the vote, and you got your five MPs. Is there an argument that says, okay, let's see how that beds in? Is this a passing phase before we start treating them as an established political party meriting a presence in the House of Lords? Is there anything in that argument?
Yeah, I'm not necessarily saying and arguing. So if Reform say that, well, they won 14%, I think that was the percentage they won at the last election. I'm not saying Reform should get 14% of all nominations, but you know, a few, just some acknowledgement. And it's not just about Reform. You know, Caroline Lucas, she was a real trendsetter MP, the first Green MP. She should be in the Lords. You know, people who have been pioneers in Parliament, who stood against, you know, maybe the mainstream, I think they should be recognised in some way. And there are so many people who are put in the Lords at the moment who are basically just partisan fodder. They've held, you know, nothing jobs inside Tory HQ or Labour HQ. And they're put there ahead of people like Caroline Lucas. I think it's just... it doesn't enrich British democracy. Right.
I mean, I just want to mention, I mean, don't consider me rude. I keep looking over your shoulder at the news monitors over your shoulder. It's because I'm looking out for the live feed from the White House briefing room in Washington, where there is to be one of those regular press briefings at some point very, very soon, I think. Caroline Levitt at the podium, questions coming from the floor. And obviously we're going to be very interested in that, given the diplomacy at the White House later on and the progress that was made or not made, depending on your point of view. I've been saying on the programme today, I've been struggling to see evidence of actual progress beyond the fact that it wasn't the complete mess that the White House meeting was in February, but we can talk about that, and I think we will. Also, you know, the developing story, the High Court judgment that ruled that a hotel in Essex could not be used to accommodate asylum seekers. The local council took that matter to court, and it came away with it being ruled to be not lawful, not in line with planning regulations. And now there's been an order that those asylum seekers should be removed from that hotel. Obviously, that has potential knock-on implications. I want to cover some of that in the story as well. But Scarlett, before we get your thought for the day, what do you make of Tim's point about peerages for reform?
Yeah, I mean, I think to me it seems that under the current system, I think Reform probably should be offered some spots in the peerages. I mean, they've been, you know, take the point about them potentially being a flash in the pan, but at this point they did win 5 MPs at the election. They did get 14% of the vote, and they've now been ahead in more than 80 consecutive polls. You know, it's really, and I think that trend doesn't look like it's going anywhere anytime quickly. I do think it is interesting, though, that they are now, that Nigel Farage, who's previously been quite sceptical, I think, about the House of Lords and about the role of those appointed peers, if he's now sort of asking for some of his own, I think that there could be some accusations of hypocrisy levelled at him. I believe there have been. But I think fundamentally, I think in terms of fairness, I think they probably should have them.
Yeah.
Well, Nigel Farage was against the European Union, but, you know, he still stood in the European Parliament because
when it's
you want to change the system from within, potentially. But so long as there is a House of Lords or a European Parliament, I think you stand for them, you want to be involved with them. Doesn't mean that ultimately you don't want them abolished.
Yes, and they are parliamentarians. Yeah. And as our Parliament sits just at the moment. Anyway, I say we're watching the story of the migrant hotel, or what was a migrant hotel in Essex. Going to be giving you more on that very, very shortly. And I'm waiting for news from the White House to hear that Caroline Levitt is at the podium, and we'll go to that live briefing in the West Wing, famous West Wing of the White House. Scarlett, what's your thought for the day?
Well, my thought for today actually was that ruling from the High Court. So the Epping Council won the High Court injunction, meaning that asylum seekers that were being accommodated in a hotel in that area will now be removed. I think it's interesting for a number of reasons. I think firstly because these protests have been bubbling away as the summer has gone on in not just Epping, in several places around the country, and they feel different. I'm sure we'll come on to this later, but they feel different from protests, I think, like this before. And then secondly, I think that the huge amount of pressure it puts on the Labour government. I think this is already a very tricky area for Labour. I think immigration is probably one of the areas they're under the most pressure on, and is the most difficult to reconcile with some of their own base and MPs, not all. And so the sort of pressure this then applies for the Home Office and for the Labour government generally, whilst trying to come up with a solution to the problem of people seeking asylum in this country, I think it's going to be quite a big deal.
Yeah, well, potentially a big deal is a fair way of describing it. Look, on this, let's talk about this now. Maybe come back to it a bit later on, but it's a not insignificant story. Tim, what's your take on this? I mean, if asylum seekers are to be allowed into this country, and there is an obligation to allow asylum seekers to claim asylum in this country, they have to be placed somewhere.
Yeah, they do. I personally think, I'm trying to remember where I had this debate last week, but I would put them in tent cities, potentially. I think the imposition on local communities, hotels that are actually often big parts of a community's life, whether it's weddings, receptions, just general adding to the tourist attraction of a place. They've had their hotels taken away from them with very significant economic implications. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of who's being housed there and the potential dangers that are associated with those people. They are, as we all know, largely men. And so, yes, John, in your question, we do have to accommodate these people, but we need to reduce the flow of people primarily across the Channel. And then those that still come here, I would house them in a very different way than we're housing them at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, with tent cities, it trips easily off the tongue. I mean, there's an obligation for accommodation when it's provided to people in this country as part of our system, in keeping with our obligation for that accommodation to be decent, to be fit for human habitation, to be sanitary, all of those things. And can we be remotely sure that tent cities provide all of that? I mean, there's been talk of army camps, which are not, as we sit here, in any condition to receive people in this way.
Well, there certainly wouldn't be a tent that I would put up. If I put up a tent, it would not be very reliable.
Well, you make a point.
The United Nations do use tents for refugees, and they hit all the criteria that you have just, quite rightly, John, required. But I am, we've heard these arguments before. I'm not saying anything new, but at the moment, British taxpayers who are seeing a lot of their services cut back, who don't think that they're getting value for money from their taxes, are seeing refugees, asylum seekers, we don't know necessarily their status until their applications have been processed, put up in hotels. And some of those hotels are quite nice, some of them are more basic. But it's not a good use of taxpayers' money. So much more basic tent cities that don't impinge upon the life of villages and towns across this country. I think it's time for those to be introduced.
Now, the company that owns this particular hotel, the Bell Hotel in Essex, you made the point that it's an imposition on the hotel to house asylum seekers in this way. The hotel says that it is important to its revenue to have the payments that go with these asylum seekers.
Well, that may be true, and there is, I think, one of the individuals that's risen most quickly up the Sunday Times rich list is someone who specialises in providing services to asylum seekers. Okay, and I'm sure he would be complaining, I think it is a he, would be complaining, my revenues are being affected if we don't have more asylum seekers. Okay, well, that's beside the point, isn't it, really? The fact is that just because some people are benefiting from asylum seekers coming over the Channel doesn't mean that we should be encouraging them.
I mean, I often spring these things on you, Scarlett, but you're thought about the way that the British public feel about this issue on asylum seekers. What key bits of data come to mind for you on the way people feel about this?
Aside from the moral question of it, I think that there's no doubt that politically speaking, the decision, which I believe happened under Grant Shapps, that asylum seekers would be housed in hotels, I think is a politically disastrous one. We can see that opposition has doubled to asylum seekers being housed in people's local areas over the last year. It's now majority opposition to it across the country. Only a very small minority support it. And I think crucially, so we now see, if you look at, for example, YouGov Most Important Issues Tracker, which has been tracking where people place their issues and their priorities over a long period of time, we could see the issue of immigration double in its salience and its importance since the policy began of placing people in asylum hotels. So it really focuses, I think, that sense of people being upset if they can see it in their own local communities.
Okay, well, that does explain some of the sense of, I suppose, political urgency in this subject. I'm going to break away there because, as promised, we're now going to cross live to the White House briefing room in Washington, D.C. Carolyn Levitt, as always, the press secretary at the podium. Let's go there.
How are you? Good to see all of you. What we've witnessed President Trump accomplish over the last few days has been nothing short of remarkable. We are now 3.5 years into the war between Russia and Ukraine, a brutal conflict that has claimed hundreds of thousands of Russian and Ukrainian lives and cost trillions of dollars. The weakness and incompetence of Joe Biden foolishly allowed the killing to start in the first place. Until President Trump returned to office in January, the bloody and broken Biden status quo was to endlessly force American taxpayers to fund Ukraine no matter the cost, no matter how long it takes, and no matter how many lives were lost. There is no denying that Biden's America Last foreign policy moved the world further away from peace. President Trump rejected that failed approach and instead, over the last 7 months, has relentlessly pursued peace throughout his second term. And thanks to President Trump's efforts, we finally have movement after years of deadly gridlock. On Friday, as you all know, many of you were there, President Trump hosted Russian President Vladimir Putin in Anchorage, Alaska, for a bilateral meeting. This was the first time President Putin has been to the United States since 2015, and the first time he has met with an American president in years. President Putin publicly confirmed what President Trump has said all along. The war between Russia and Ukraine never would have started in the first place if President Trump were in office. This was always obvious to any person with a shred of common sense. Just look at what took place during the last 4 administrations. Under George W. Bush, Russia invaded Georgia. Under Barack Obama, Russia took Crimea. Under Joe Biden, Russia invaded Ukraine. But under President Trump, Russia did not invade nor take anything. President Trump is the only president this century, Republican or Democrat, who has held Russia in check and ensured peace in Europe. That's because Russia has always greatly respected President Trump and his peace through strength foreign policy approach. But overall, the bilateral talks in Alaska were very productive, and multiple key points were agreed to between the two leaders that truly opened up the door for Phase 2 discussions, which took place yesterday here at the White House. Within 48 hours of that meeting in Anchorage, I may add. As you all know, there were many European leaders here, as well as Ukrainian President Zelensky. They all traveled here to meet with President Trump to maintain the momentum and work toward a lasting peace. Across the board, every leader credited President Trump for his decisive leadership that has reignited the dialogue in hopes of finally bringing this war to a peaceful conclusion. 2 quotes in particular capture the progress that was made and the optimism moving forward. Finnish President Alexander Stubb said, "I think in the past 2 weeks, we've probably had more progress in ending this war than we have had in the past 3.5 years. Again, that is the president of Finland, a country that shares a border with Russia. That's what we call the President Trump effect. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte also summed it up well. Without President Trump, this deadlock with Putin would not have been broken. He is the only one who could do this." Following the encouraging conversations yesterday, President Trump spoke with President Putin by phone, and he agreed to begin the next phase of the peace process, a meeting between President Putin and President Zelensky, which would be followed, if necessary, by a trilateral meeting between President Putin, President Zelensky, and President Trump. As the president said, Vice President Vance, Secretary Rubio, and Special Envoy Witkoff will continue to coordinate with Russia and Ukraine to make this happen as soon as possible. It's very important to remember that before President Trump's landslide victory last November, there was no end in sight to this bloodshed. Now, there may finally be light at the end of the tunnel and an opportunity for lasting peace. That's because President Trump is the peace president, and American leadership is back on the world stage. It should not be lost on anyone in this room that world leaders are coming right here to Washington, D.C. for help. While previous presidents have traveled halfway around the world to apologize for America, President Trump stands up for America, and he has firmly restored America's status as the undisputed leader of the free world. However, one thing that has absolutely not changed is the media's negative and downright false coverage of President Trump and his foreign policy accomplishments. From the beginning of this entire process, much of the left-wing media has been actively rooting against the President of the United States in the pursuit of peace. Initially, the media ridiculously claimed that President Trump was somehow beholden to Russia for even agreeing to have a face-to-face discussion with President Putin inside of the United States. The media said President Trump was making a grave mistake by, quote, legitimizing Putin. They were aghast that President Trump would treat another world leader like a world leader. The media relentlessly attacked President Trump and claimed he suffered a, quote, major defeat for not immediately emerging with a final agreement, even though he said heading into that meeting, this was a meeting to listen and to understand how to move the ball forward. All weekend following those historic U.S.-Russia bilateral talks, we listened to clueless pundits on television trying but failing to claim that the president had failed. The so-called experts in the foreign policy establishment, whose record is nothing but endless wars, trillions of wasted taxpayer dollars, and dead Americans, have the nerve to try and lecture President Trump, who has solved 7 global conflicts in 7 months, about peace. This is the same president, by the way, who brokered the Abraham Accords in his first term, on top of more than half a dozen other peace deals this year alone, as I just said. We also saw yesterday the president of Ukraine and all of the other major leaders of Europe fly across the Atlantic Ocean to meet President Trump at the White House because of the progress that was made, and that, if you ask the media, failed meeting, but it was not. It was highly productive and it was successful. This is why Americans' trust in the mass media is at a lowest point in more than 5 decades. Diplomacy is a delicate process, and instead of reporting the facts about what is happening here at this White House and what is happening between this president and other leaders around the world, many outlets in this room continue to try to actively undermine the president and sabotage the efforts towards peace. That is why I felt the need to set the record straight. In other news, on the home front, President Trump's efforts to make D.C. safe again are working. There have been a total of 465 arrests since the start of this operation on Thursday, August 7th. Last night, there were a total of 52 arrests, including the arrest of an illegal alien MS-13 gang member with convictions for DWI and drug possession. Thanks to President Trump's leadership and the outstanding...
Okay, we're going to pull away from that live feed from the White House briefing room, the press secretary getting deeply involved in some of those other pretty hot, contentious topics on the political agenda in the United States, among them the troops, National Guard troops on the streets of the Capitol, sent in, provided by, 5 Republican-led states now said to enforce law and order, although it is argued that the crime rates in Washington, D.C. have been falling and not rising. However, that argument is a lively one, and there are others too, which we maybe needed to get you up to date with in the course of this hour. But Scarlett Maguire, Tim Montgomerie are here with us. We were listening to Carolyn Levitt doing what Carolyn Levitt does and tell us about the latest triumph of Donald Trump in bringing people together to the White House, that busload of European leaders, and what came out of it. Was it constructive? Was it useful? We're going to be talking about that in just a minute with our guests, and I hope with you. This is Pienaar Friends on Times Radio. We're following the White House. Stay with us.
Listen in the Times Radio app or wherever you get your podcasts.
John Pienaar on Times Radio.
And here with me on Pienaar and Friends, Tim Montgomerie, commentator, and Scarlett Maguire, the pollster. And we're watching the live feed from the White House in Washington, D.C. Carolyn Levitt, the press secretary to the president, at the podium. I want to go straight back there because questions are now being thrown about the question of guaranteeing security for Ukraine when and if and as peace comes. Lots of questions about how that force to guarantee that peace would be formed, what its role would be. What a role would America play? We do know that Donald Trump is saying there'd be no American troops on the ground. Let's have a listen to the questioning.
Well, you got to the heart of what I was going to say to all of you today on security guarantees, which is the president has definitively stated U.S. boots will not be on the ground in Ukraine, but we can certainly help in the coordination and perhaps provide other means of security guarantees to our European allies. The president understands security guarantees are crucially important to ensure a lasting peace, and he has directed his national security team to coordinate with our friends in Europe and also to continue to cooperate and discuss these matters with Ukraine and Russia as well.
Caroline, now have the Russians responded at all? I know we spoke with President Putin last night. What has been their response? Because we've heard some reports from the Kremlin and others saying they're unequivocally against NATO troops on the ground.
Well, look, the president continues to have these conversations with both leaders. Those conversations took place in Anchorage, Alaska, again yesterday with the Europeans and President Zelensky, and he has directed his team to come up with a framework for these security guarantees that can be acceptable to help ensure a lasting peace and end this war.
And then just last question real quick on this. Regarding some of the funding, we're hearing questions about another round of weapons sales or possibly a round of U.S. purchases of Ukrainian drones. Will that money be funded by the U.S. taxpayers? Are we finally going to see an end to the U.S. taxpayer-funded, seemingly endless mandate for these foreign wars?
Well, the president is very sensitive to the needs of the American taxpayer, and immediately upon entering office back in January, he made it very clear that we're not going to continue writing blank checks to fund a war very far away, which is why he came up with the very creative solution to have NATO purchase American weaponry, because it is the best in the world, and then to backfill the needs of the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian people and their military. So that's the solution the president has came up with. We'll continue to see that forward. As for any additional sales, I'll have to defer you to the Department of Defense.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jack. Kelly.
What has President Trump learned that tells him that Vladimir Putin would be willing to make a deal for him, for President Trump?
Well, the president has learned a lot, which is part of the reason he opened up this dialogue. The previous administration, who oversaw the beginning of this war, refused to talk. And President Trump has always said, in order to learn, in order to move the ball forward with diplomacy and towards peace, you have to have open dialogue. And so that's why the president has had several conversations by phone and, of course, an in-person meeting last Friday with President Putin. He also has talked to President Zelensky dozens of times, had him here at the White House yesterday, and he's understanding what both sides want, what both sides are going to have to give up. And he has always said, in order to get a good deal, both sides are going to have to walk away a little bit unhappy. So he continues to learn a lot throughout these conversations, which is why we've seen progress from both sides. And I would also just add, when it comes to learning and moving the ball forward, look at how both Russia and Ukraine have actually talked directly for the first time in many years, thanks to the efforts of this president and this administration.
Specifically for President Trump, though, what do you think Putin's motivation is to try to do something for President Trump, as opposed to just resolving the conflict?
I think, as I just spoke to in my opening remarks, Kelly, Russia and all countries around this world actually respect the United States again. And the president is using the might of American strength to demand that respect from our allies, our friends, our adversaries all around the world. And we've seen that not just lead to progress with Russia and Ukraine, but also we've seen it in the closing of 7 global conflicts around the world as well. We've seen it with the release of hostages in Gaza. You've seen it with...
Okay, we're going to pull away there from that live feed. We're watching it closely for you. Anything more that comes up on this ever developing story. Argument, I promise you will miss nothing. Tim Montgomerie and Scarlett Maguire are here with me. We just heard a second ago, guys, Caroline, they were telling us that America was respected by Russia again. Tim, do you think that has much to do with the fact that President Trump is now pretty much echoing what the president of Russia might be saying when he's at the microphone?
I don't think she just said that it was respected by Russia. She said, perhaps more controversially, that it was respected by lots of powers.
Well, she said Russia respects the US again.
Yeah, but she also said, in the wider parts of her remarks, she said respected by Europe as well. She was putting it in context of the visits of European leaders yesterday. What I do think about this is, would Putin have sat down with Biden and been part of any kind of negotiation? There was such hostility there. It's very difficult to see that is happening. Now, I saw the summit in Alaska on Friday evening and the red carpet treatment, and it stuck in my throat.
Yes.
I don't like it.
Why did it stick in your throat?
Because, well, I think I've mentioned this previously on this programme, but there's all sorts of incidents in the Russia-Ukraine war which are stuck in my memory. One of the ones that most lingers is a mother who lost her son that day to Russian troops invading her village. And while she was mourning her son, outside that night, Russian soldiers were having a campfire, drunkenly singing songs. Who was the author of that? It was Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin did that. So, in terms of matching anyone's disdain, hatred, contempt for what Putin has done, I'm there. But I think it's the case. The figures are always contested, but I think in the last month, nearly 40,000 young men, Ukrainians and Russians, died. This is a loss of life taking place in our continent on a scale that we have not seen in the post-war period. And Trump is wanting to end this war. That wasn't the case for Biden. I didn't see any impetus from him to end this war. And how do you end a war? How do you end a war when you've got these huge personalities with, there's both sides of state a lot in this war? Now, yeah, I am absolutely with you, I think, John, in saying that Russia is the villain in this. But both sides aren't going to back down easily. And Trump is taking risks, and some of those risks are unpalatable. But he's taking risks to end this conflict. And back to where we began, do you want Russia respecting America? Perhaps not. But you want Russia at least being willing to talk to America and talk to the American president. And somehow Trump has engineered that. That's not nothing.
The concern I was echoing there was the fact that Trump is in Vladimir Putin's good books, really self-evidently. And you look at the response to Alaska and then yesterday at the White House on Russian media, it is in terms of Russian triumph. And we can argue about this in a minute, debate it in a minute after the news, because, I suggest there's a very good reason why Russia, why Kremlin, should be triumphant rather than friends of Ukraine. We can talk about that. Looking forward to that. Coming up right after the news here on Pienaar and Friends with Laura Cook.
Across the
on DAB Digital Radio, on the free Times Radio app, and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
And I'm John Pienaar with Pienaar Friends. Tim Montgomerie here with me, so Scarlett Maguire. And I'm joined by Kate Borsey, who takes over at 7. Hello, Kate.
Hiya, John. An exclusive story to bring you on the show tonight. It's just gone up on the Times.com for those interested. Shanti Das of the Times, senior investigations reporter, has been looking into the far-right activist Tommy Robinson, who's making a lot of money, John, thousands of pounds, charging people who request video consultations from him, offering expert advice on things like anti-Islam activism. The Times went undercover and requested quite a few videos, and he sent back 4 actually in total, received beginning of August, and the Times asked him his advice on protesting and anti-Islam activism. The videos received feature Robinson speaking about dealing with infiltration by security services, describing protests at hotels housing asylum seekers. We know, big topic of conversation today in Epping. He described those protests as brilliant and says it was brilliant the fact it's not coordinated by anyone like me, and the protest would give people a sense of confidence in standing up. Now, he doesn't directly encourage violent approaches. He doesn't condone violent approaches or violence in any of the videos that the Times has seen. But there are questions really about how much checking the service is doing of videos. The videos are available through a service called Minect, who say that they comply with all relevant laws in jurisdictions where we operate. They strictly prohibit content that contains threats, incites violence or promotes illegal activity. But there is a question to be asked here about what content is being requested and what is coming through. The Times quotes some information from the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, who've raised their concerns about the potential for radicalisation and a lack of oversight of the app concerned. So, yeah, you can order these. They cost $50, the average video, typically last a couple of minutes. And so far, the Times reports Tommy Robinson's made just over £9,000 from them. Fascinating story, Kate, and you'll be going to that in detail. I'm looking at now the story in the Times, which talks about these Tommy Robinson videos. It says, well, the reporting of this story tells us that the reporting went to some of those who were spreading racist messages, some who are in support of violence, who are warning about various things that they want to combat. And Robinson is making what looks like quite a lucrative affair out of giving them the sort of advice they're looking for. Yeah, absolutely. Lots more in the Times on that. We'll be speaking to Shanti Das, who's led the investigation on that one. We'll extend the conversation further. We'll, of course, talk about what's been happening in Epping as well. We'll go to a journalist who covered the Epping protest and ask what this means for housing asylum seekers going forward. I know, Tim, you were talking about sort of migrant camps, were you? And I was pondering earlier how difficult it is to house asylum seekers. Of course, there shouldn't be thousands of them housed in hotels or anywhere else, really. The processing should be quicker. But while there are tens of thousands waiting for decisions, you can take two views on it. You know, part of you thinks, well, actually, should we be making more use of former RAF bases? It's worked, if you like, in Wethersfield near Braintree. Plans to increase capacity there to over 1,200 by 50%. But other cases like RAF Scrampton in Lincolnshire, plans dropped by Labour last year because it's just not cost effective to be able to house asylum seekers. So the appeal, I suppose, is to put large amounts of them in one place so that it's not localised. The benefit, of course, of localising is that you're not just shoving them in some sort of encampment or in some sort of large-scale area. But of course, we've seen in the case of Epping how that can really inflame local tensions and cause a lot of upset. I think it also
adds somewhat to the disincentive effect. You know, it's not such an attractive thought to come to a set of camps rather than a hotel.
There are still questions about what should be done. I mean, the former government tried the Bibi Stockholm barge, didn't they? That ended in November last year. It is a conundrum, and whilst you've got, thousands, tens of thousands waiting for decisions, we do need to think about best approach. The government needs to think about best approach. And meanwhile, many people who are celebrating the judgment, the temporary injunction in Epping, are saying, well, this gives other councils the perfect blueprint to be able to argue, because that particular hotel did not consult the local authority or the local authority's planning department on whether that was suitable use for that hotel. any other hotel who's housing asylum seekers needs to consider whether they've done that and whether they should be doing that. And local authorities who aren't pleased about asylum hotels in their particular area can get into that level of fine print.
Yeah. What about the argument, before we move on from this, because you'll be taking it up as well on your show, Kate, the argument that the migrants who come to this country and are being housed in this and other ways present a particular risk to women and children in this country. I mean, is that an entirely reasonable argument to tar all migrants with that same horrendous brush, do you think, Tim?
Well, clearly not tar all of them, because a lot of them will be decent people.
No, but the problem's being presented in those terms significantly over and over again, isn't it?
Well, I think there is, and so there are statistics that show that certain groups from certain national origins are much more likely to commit crimes of violence against women than other nationalities. So the statistics are there that do prove that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was some question about the meaning of some of the statistics that are available out there, Scarlett, when we look at the incidence of sex crime and other crime among migrants coming to this country, as opposed to the wider population, given the size of the sample and so on.
Yes, I mean, the crime survey statistics always come under quite a lot of scrutiny, and I don't think are a perfect metric by any means. But I would just say qualitatively, it's something that I've heard raised in focus groups for the last 2 years. I mean, when the Conservatives were still in government, concern, and again, actually concern, especially them relating to the safety of women and girls. Now, again, whether that's borne out in numbers, the statistics Tim is referring to show that it is, that they are overrepresented and some of these crimes. Whether or not you put much stock in those statistics, I think the fact that people in these communities feel that it's the case is something that I've definitely seen.
Right, going to leave that one out for the moment. I want to go back to because I'm going to talk to you, Kate, your show at 7 o'clock right after this. I'm going to go back now to the White House. We're joined by George Grills, the Times Washington correspondent, live on the line. Hello to you, George.
Good afternoon.
Hi. So look, we've heard from Caroline Leavitt defending the position of the President of the United States in the robust way that she does. This was Caroline Leavitt speaking just a short while ago to the media at the White House.
Until President Trump returned to office in January, the bloody and broken Biden status quo was to endlessly force American taxpayers to fund Ukraine no matter the cost, no matter how long it takes, and no matter how many lives were lost. There is no denying that Biden's America Last foreign policy moved the world further away from peace. President Trump rejected that failed approach and instead, over the last 7 months, has relentlessly pursued peace throughout his second term. And thanks to President Trump's efforts, we finally have movement after years of deadly gridlock.
That's Caroline Leavitt speaking just a very short while ago. George Grills watching it all from Washington, D.C. What are your thoughts, Joe? George, there's Caroline Leavitt doing what she does, presenting what was done over these last recent days in terms of triumph. How is this being presented there in the American capital?
Well, Trump has felt very stunned, basically, since the summit with Putin in Alaska, because he's not received particularly good reviews back home in the US, and he's been reading the papers and basically getting himself wound up at how he hasn't been celebrated for this summit that he kind of thought he ought to be. And, you know, just in the run-up to the Zelensky meeting, he fired off a number of Truth Socials kind of complaining that he had been unfairly treated. And we kind of saw that today again at the beginning of the Caroline Leavitt briefing, where they went on about how, you know, his approach to handling Putin has been extremely successful, and, you know, he's doing a great job, all the rest of it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm putting the construction on what happened yesterday that one might expect, and no doubt from her side a great deal of sincerity. Your own judgment on this, George. I've been spending my time on air today looking at the question of how useful, how constructive was the exercise at the White House after what happened in Alaska on Friday, and struggling to see evidence that what happened was something to be celebrated by anyone, much really beyond the Kremlin, beyond Putin and his gang in Moscow. And that's not an isolated perception. There are many pretty thoughtful people who take the same sort of view on the facts, George.
So if we go back to Alaska, if you think about what he said then, he said the meeting with Putin would be a precursor to a trilateral summit between himself, Putin, and Zelensky. Then following that, this meeting yesterday, he kind of dropped that sequencing and said instead, no, actually Zelensky and Putin need to have their face-to-face meeting first, and then I'll attend, in the words of Caroline Levitt, if necessary afterwards. Now, bear in mind that Putin, during his call with Trump, reportedly suggested the meeting place for himself and Zelensky as Moscow, which basically makes it impossible for the Ukrainian leader to attend because it would be seen as a humiliation for him to go to Moscow. And bear in mind, given what's happened to Russia, Putin's political opponents in Russia, he would probably risk assassination as well. So Putin also set the terms for what the next meeting would be. If you remember his closing words in that press conference with Trump in Alaska, he suddenly switched to English. Bear in mind, he rarely uses English in public, but he switched to English at this important moment. And he made this apparently off-the-cuff joke. In fact, it was quite clearly scripted by the Kremlin to say next time it will be in Moscow. And that was setting the terms for what the next sort of meeting would be.
Yeah.
So, you would have to say over the past week or so, we've moved to a position where you have to feel the US is kind of backing out of wanting much of a role in kind of brokering an agreement. And you've even seen Trump himself say, the figure increases daily. He used to say he'd sold 5 wars, now we're up to 7. But he says that this one in Ukraine was supposed to be the easiest, and it's proving to be a bit tricky. And you can kind of feel a waning interest in kind of trying to resolve it.
That's a really interesting thought. Get Tim's thoughts and Scarlett's and yours as you listen to all of this discussion and debate here on Pienaar and Friends on Times Radio.
Get the day's politics, business and
And with us on Pienaar and Friends, Tim Montgomerie, Scarlett Maguire, and George Grills is live on the line, the Times Washington correspondent. So, George, I want to bring Scarlett and Tim into this, and it's great to have you here with us this evening. We're hearing more and more about the idea of a meeting, between Zelensky and Putin, maybe trilateral, three-sided with Putin, with Trump getting involved. The big problem with all of that, as we sit here, is that the war goes on, and Donald Trump has dropped his objections, or rather said he's no longer seeking a ceasefire as a precondition to talks. Now, when yesterday we heard from President Trump in the White House, he kind of ducked questions about all of that. Has there been any kind of elaboration of that position from the White House today?
Well, I think what has mainly happened is, if you recall a few weeks ago, Trump's strategy was carrot and stick. So he said, to Putin, if you don't stop the war by August the 8th, then I will impose huge secondary sanctions on those countries that buy Russian oil. Then basically Putin said, forget about the August the 8th deadline. We'll have a bilateral meeting. We'll sort it all out there. So the threat of sanctions were pushed back a bit further. In fact, he put some kind of 50% tariffs on India, but by and large, the kind of majority of the sanctions that have been promised didn't come through. Since that point, we haven't seen Russia agree to a ceasefire at all, and the sanctions haven't been leveraged. And basically the stick has been removed from the equation, you would have to say. And now Trump is basically saying to Putin, I'd quite like you to attend this bilateral summit with Zelensky, but there's no stick to get him there.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's simply a statement of fact. I mean, the threat of sanctions seems to have evaporated. The demand for a ceasefire, likewise. I mean, Tim and Scarlett, listening to this, what are your thoughts, Scarlett?
Yeah, hi George. I think it's interesting because obviously Trump actually had, in some senses, a reasonably tricky summer. Especially, I think he was very obviously uncomfortable with some of the pressure that was exerted on him to reveal more about Epstein and whatever relation he may or may not have had with him, and especially from his own base. I was just wondering whether, I mean, it does seem, especially watching from London, that once again Trump is sort of managing to yank the world, according to him, that the world is spinning once more on sort of Trump's axis. But whether he's successfully has been able to move the domestic conversation, especially again with parts of his base that have been unhappy with him, so that now they're focusing on Russia and Ukraine and not on Trump.
I think that's definitely right. He's moved the conversation on from earlier this summer, and even when it comes to the Epstein kind of scandal and questions around that, I think he's starting to kind of satisfy his base and the kind of MAGA conspiracists who support him by kind of dragging Clinton into it and turning it into more of a kind of Clinton scandal. And so that's why you see, they're trying to get a number of people to kind of give depositions where basically you're talking about Clinton rather than Trump. And that, it obviously has the twin benefits of being a kind of political, you can punch the Democrats politically on it, but also you're moving the conversation on. But yeah, everything is overshadowed at the moment by Russia and Ukraine, A, and B, deploying troops to the streets of DC.
Yeah, I want to come back to that question of troops on the streets of the capital in just a second too, if I can, George. But Tim, what are you thinking at this moment?
I think there's perhaps a little bit of lack of charity towards Donald Trump in the analysis so far. I think I've thought for a long time that Trump clearly is anti-war. It's something that the comedian who has a show on I think CNN now, Bill Maher, talks about, is really that you may not like him, and Bill Maher certainly didn't support him in the presidential election, but here is someone who desperately dislikes the death of people in war, and he's trying to end this conflict, which, as we've spoken about already, has killed so many Europeans over the last few months. And I disagree that there's no impetus for something. We had the summit in Alaska on Friday, and since then, we've had much greater commitment, particularly by Europeans, with American coordination to security guarantees to Ukraine. And if this summit does happen between Zelensky and Putin, Putin will see that Trump has helped marshal significant security commitments to Ukraine. And so I think to say that we aren't seeing anything happen is wrong. I think we are seeing one of the biggest gatherings of global leaders in the support of a peace process we've ever seen. And yes, there haven't been sanctions put on Russia, but I think, George, you just acknowledged the sanctions on India will potentially affect Russia quite considerably if they're followed through. Yeah.
And George was also, I think, suggesting that even the sanctions on India, those punches were rather pulled, having been announced.
They? Well, that isn't good. Then I thought they had been,
and
they weren't
no follow through when it comes to China. At the beginning of this process of Trump sounding tougher about Russia, he was suggesting that China might even be included in that kind of secondary action. Set of plans. Now that idea.
China really does need to be included, because China really is providing the wherewithal for Russia to do the drone attacks on Ukraine.
Which would be a brave step if it's taken, but so far hasn't happened. George, if you're still with us, can you get us up to speed, those who haven't been following this closely, on the troops in uniform on the streets of the capital, Washington DC? There, we're told to support the local law enforcement, and the authorities of the city say no need for any such thing. Just get us up to date with that story now.
It's a kind of continuation of the theme we saw earlier this summer. If you might recall, the National Guard and actually Marines as well were deployed to Los Angeles after there were kind of protests that broke out against the Trump's kind of immigration raids on businesses that were employing illegal migrants. And he sent in the troops on that occasion, and there was a big row with local Democrat politicians. He's kind of tried to engineer the same thing in DC, but the mayor is at the moment not really rising to the bait. And also, I'd say the crucial difference between LA and DC is that in LA you had those kind of images of protesters standing atop burnt out cars waving Mexican flags, which is, you know, such an arresting image that he could kind of rely on to kind of keep fueling this talking point. Whereas there hasn't really been that moment so far in Washington. You haven't seen widespread protests break out or anything like that to lead to those kind of confrontations. A number of Republican governors and Republican states have also kind of deployed their National Guard to supplement the troops that were kind of mobilized from the District of Columbia. I mean, I have to say, wandering around the streets of DC since they were mobilized, a week ago or so, I genuinely haven't seen a single soldier yet. So their presence, I think, is fairly limited to defending federal buildings, you know, around the mall and central Washington. But yeah, it's part of a clear campaign which is about law and order ahead of the midterms next year, and it's an area where the Republicans think they're very strong, and they think the Democrats are weak.
Yeah. Tim.
George, I don't know if you saw the president yesterday said that someone who hadn't been out for dinner for 4 years suddenly felt the confidence to go out with their wife. I don't suppose there have been any efforts to find out whether this person actually exists, have there?
Well, I believe he had an exchange on Fox News earlier today where he revealed it was one of the Fox News presenters that he was actually talking with, who he was referencing. So.
Maybe just someone who needs to get out more. I mean, on the facts, because we are concerned with facts, aren't we? On this show, not just sometimes, but all the time. What is the objective evidence about the state of the problem of crime in Washington D.C.? I've heard counter arguments that in, for example, a city in the constituency of the Speaker of the House, the Republican Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, they've got far more crime than they have in Washington D.C. What is the evidence, the data tell us, George?
Well, there are definitely sketchy parts of DC, but the kind of peak in violent crime actually came about 2 years ago, and it's basically been on a downward trend ever since. And actually last year was a kind of record low for about 30 years. So like any American, you know, city, it does have, you know, inner city crime. It's got its problems, you know, but, you know, you would have to say in the past 2 years, they seem to have been improving the situation. So the decision to deploy troops now is obviously, you know, taken at a time when things seem to be moving in the right direction.
Yeah, it's another one of those reminders, as if we needed it, that America's a different country. America's a foreign country with we share the language, but in so many ways there's a lot that we don't share. Imagine if troops had been deployed around here, around this borough around here where we are in London Bridge, or anywhere in London, whether we got our problems with crime. It couldn't happen, he said. Hopefully it wouldn't happen, he said. Hopefully. What an extraordinary story.
Absolutely extraordinary story. And I do have to say, though, just sort of anecdotally, I was quite shocked. I started going to DC regularly about 2.5 years ago. And the first time I stayed, I was put up in an unfortunate part of town. I was put on sort of this Chinatown district, street road. But I was put up in a hotel. I was wondering that. And I was shocked because I came down in the daytime and could barely open the hotel door because there were people collapsed due to drugs and all the rest of it outside the front door. And I have to say that it was quite, and perhaps this tallies with what John was just saying, or one of you was just saying about the crime peak happening 2 years ago, which would have been about then. But I was quite shocked by the state of some parts of DC.
Yeah. But to the point of needing uniformed troops on the streets, that's a slightly different order of response, one would have thought. And I'm tempted, without wanting to sound ever too cynical, a certain amount of politics.
Oh, John.
My goodness me. He said, I'm shocked to see that there's politics being played in America just at the moment. George, it's been so good to have you with us. Thank you so much. And lovely to talk to you, Tim. Thanks as always. Scarlett, always a pleasure. Let's do it again same time next week. Angus Mitchell was our producer today. Azat Marley was at the keyboards. Immaculate as ever. I'm back tomorrow. Kate Borse is up next, and this is Times Radio.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio, the voice of the Times.
Thanks, John. Have a great night. It is 7 o'clock. This is the evening edition with Kate Borsay. Coming up...
If you were Russia, who would want to have your enemy, your opponent, sitting on your line? You don't do that. It was always thought that Ukraine was a buffer between Russia and the rest of Europe.
Donald Trump has reiterated that the US will not send troops to Ukraine as part of a peace deal and that Vladimir Putin may not want an agreement at all. We'll get the views of a former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of